Do you want better hip mobility? Maybe you want that mobility for improving your squat or improving your deadlift. That's what we're going to talk about in this tutorial. We're going to be looking at it from a beginner's perspective. So we're going to keep things simple, but we're going to try and keep it as logical a process as we can and as clear and concise a process as we can so you can get started right away. If you live in the UK and you do want some help improving your hip mobility, then just click the link below and you'll go through to my hip mobility program page. What you'll do is you enter your details. I'll send you a questionnaire, you get that answered. We then get you booked in for a consultation, assessment and programming here at the gym. So you'll come to the gym for 2 hours and we'll go through that whole process. So we'll understand your goals, I'll understand your hips, and then we'll start to put in place a program for you so you can improve your hip mobility for whatever goal you want to achieve. The first thing that we need to understand is what's happening at the hip. So what hip mobility do you need? Do you need greater hip flexion? Do you need greater hip extension? Do you need greater hip external rotation or greater hip internal rotation? If we can understand which ones we need, then we can start putting in place the building blocks to improve them. Now it could be all 4 of them, could be 2 of them, could be 3 of them, could be 1 of them. But first of all, we need to understand what they are. So first of all, hip flexion. Well, hip flexion is that movement. If we're squatting, it's that movement. So it's that hip hinge movement. So if we need greater hip flexion, that's what we need to understand. If it's external rotation, it's where we would externally rotate the toes and the knee, or that's external rotation of the hip. Obviously the same the other way. Internal rotation is the opposite, where it turns inward. And then extension is where we come up into this position. So whichever one we need, which again, as I mentioned, could be 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of them, we have to put in place some simple strategies to be able to get us there. A way that we can test that, well, a way that we can test hip internal and external rotation certainly is just sitting on a bench and just going into that position, or getting my hands on and getting into that position. So that's my external rotation. Again, we can do the same with internal rotation. So we just, first of all, need to understand what we're testing. So that's the external rotation, that's the internal rotation. With regards to hip flexion, we would put the hand on the back and we would just look at coming down into this position. You can also do an active straight leg raise, which is useful and it has its place, but it's not necessarily complete if it's for squat or if it's for deadlift. But we have to understand it. But as I mentioned, the first thing we need to do is assess the hip, understand which one it is that we need, so we can then put it in place. So we've got the 4. We've got the hip flexion, hip extension, hip external rotation and hip internal rotation. If we work that out, we can then get into some mobility exercises and stretches to get you beyond where you are now. First of all, we'll look at hip flexion. So the muscles that we're going to be looking at, psoas, adductors, rectus femoris. The reason for that, there are others that we could look at, but I want to try and keep it as simple as possible and see if we can get some quick wins as quickly as possible. So, psoas, rectus femoris, adductors. What we're looking to do, if it's for a squat that is, and we need to get down into that position, to be able to tilt the pelvis and get down in there, we need a bit of extra length through those 3 muscles to be able to get down there. So when we talk about psoas, what we would do is come into this position, down on one knee, and we would lift. That's getting the full length of the psoas, even the fibres that join into T12 and up into the diaphragm. So we're coming into that position, we would spend a bit of time there, 30 seconds, 60 seconds, 90 seconds, even 120 seconds, and then we would swap over. So that's the psoas. We would then look at rectus femoris, which is where we would hook a foot up here, and push the hips in, and then we feel it go right down the thigh. This one joins onto the front of the pelvis, so again it's another key hip flexor, but in order to get down into that hip flexion, we need this muscle to get longer because it needs to tuck its way back into the hip, much the same as the psoas. So we get into there, again we would hold that 30, 60, 90, 120 seconds, depending on the tightness. Then adductors, so we get into this position and holding there. If we want to increase the stretch, we just take that foot away from this knee and get back into there. Now, obviously, we would do that routine on both sides, and then that's going to give us a greater ability to get down into that position. Now, what I also do say with this is that we will probably need to do some sort of foam rolling or massage before and some potentially mobility exercises afterwards. So these stretches would be sandwiched in between this type of formula with some foam rolling and some mobility exercises afterwards. Number 2 is improving hip external rotation. So what we're going to do is going to go after the glute medius, glute minimus, and a little bit of the tensor fasciae lata, TFL. So we're going to come in behind the bench. We can do it on a raised surface like this, like so. If you just see it from the side view, like so. So we got bent across here, bent leg at the back. Again, both sides, 30, 60, 90, 120 seconds, whatever feels more comfortable. So we're getting into that position. The second one for the TFL is where we would lie down on our backs and then very simply just come into that position there. So we're holding that position and we're starting to open out the hips in external and internal rotation, which is going to allow our hips to be able to open out and get further down if it's a squat that you want to get down into it. Number 3, hip extension, is where we again would look at opening out the front of the hip. I know hip flexion is a little bit counterintuitive, but I don't think people really understand the importance of the length of the psoas and the rectus femoris in hip flexion. But it's very similar for hip extension. So we would do the same stretches. We would come down here, we would be up. Again, getting as much length as we can. We may go a little bit more into extension here than we would with the hip flexion, but essentially we're trying to open out the whole of the front side of the body, and that's what that stretch does. Same with the other one, the rectus femoris. Again, we come into here and we come up and we get into this position, holding nice and strong. Again, get as much flexion of the knee as we can, getting the foot up as high as we can and pushing that hip forward as best we can. So again, this would all obviously be done on both sides, 30, 60, 90, 120 seconds. And then the final one, which is slightly different, again, we would go back into TFL because the TFL just sits on the front of the hip. Now, this will also get glute medius, the anterior portions, but just coming into that position and just using the weight of that leg to pull that one down into that, what would be hip internal rotation. But again, that will aid with the hip extension. And finally, hip internal rotation. Again, very similar to ones we've done before. Number 1 will be psoas, up into this position, getting that length going through there. The second one, again, we've done already, is the TFL. And again, with the TFL, it's more of an internal rotation stretch because there will be portions of the anterior glute medius. So it's where we would come down into this position and just rotate through and just allow that to open out in that position. Again, all of these, both sides, between 30 seconds and 2 minutes to hold it for. So again, just opening out that position. And then finally, we need to be doing the adductors. So we would come on to this position. And again, just opening out, holding, holding, holding. If you need a bit more, just take that foot away from that knee and just hold there. And that is the internal rotation. To summarise what we've talked about with regards to hip mobility, the first thing we need to do is understand what we need. Do we need flexion, extension, external or internal rotation? Do we need all of them? Do we need 2 of them? Do we need 3 of them? Do we need 1 of them? Understand that first. Then we can go about starting to open that out. Once we've started to open it out, we would just retest it. So make sure that what we're wanting to happen is happening. Once we've got all of that, we can then start to achieve the goals that we want to achieve, be it squatting, be it deadlifting, be it just wanting more hip mobility, which can relieve stress on the lower back, which can just get the hips functioning more effectively. If you do want help with any of that, just click the link below. That is if you're in the UK. You can come to this gym Again, we'll spend 2 hours together, consultation, assessment, full workshop on hip mobility, and then I'll write up everything that we go through, put it into a plan, put it into a program that's specific to you, tailored to you, that you can take away with you and put into practice.